morning and welcome to Rising. We have another great show for you today on this Thursday. How are you doing, Briahna?
I'm doing well, Robby. And yourself?
I'm doing just fine. I'm going to New York City today after the show tapes, so I haven't been there in like a year.
I'm jealous. I love New York. I miss New York. I'm jealous.
All right. What are we talking about?
All right. Well, Robby, yesterday, Jewish peace protesters surrounded the Democratic National Committee headquarters in D.C. last night, which prompted a lockdown of all U.S. House office buildings after police forcibly removed the demonstrators from blocking the building's exits. Congressman Brad Sherman posted about the scuffle last night, tweeting, "I was just evacuated from the DNC after pro-terrorist, anti-Israel protesters grew violent, pepper spraying police officers and attempting to break into the building." The activists, however, refuted that claim. They said it was police that used pepper spray, not protesters, and they have some photographic evidence that you see on the screen now to back that up. Friend of the show and reporter for Semaphore, Dave Weigel, was at the protest, and he weighed in, saying nobody tried to enter the building. They were trying to block off entrances, but had their backs turned to them.
Yeah, yesterday, more than 500 staffers and political appointees from more than 40 agencies sent a letter to President Biden and his cabinet criticizing the extent of the administration's support for Israel and its war in Gaza. Plus, new Reuters polling released just yesterday finds that a whopping 68% of Americans want a ceasefire, including about 75% of Americans and 50% of Republicans.
I think it's 75% of Democrats. And
excuse me. As Prem Thacker of The Intercept points out, just 4.5% of Congress currently support a ceasefire. So Dave Weigel is a pretty straight shooter, not a
leftist ideologue by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But he's very knowledgeable about the left because
so
he's
if he says
so
that it wasn't the protesters weren't trying to break in and they weren't pepper spraying anyone, I would tend to believe him.
Yeah, so that's the thing. There was so much video and photographic evidence from it. I mean, that one picture, maybe we can throw it up again, of the police officer literally aiming the pepper spray at protesters. I tweeted last night when it was happening, does anybody have any other evidence? Of course, it could be multiple pepper spraying events that have happened. No one else has adduced any other images of pepper spraying. And the officer that is pictured there spraying the pepper spray also was the same officer in another video who was shown kicking over the memorial candles that these Jewish Voices for Peace protesters had placed around as a vigil of sorts. So it does seem to all connect in the timeline. And then I also saw some video evidence, I think that Ryan Grimm had posted, of what the protests actually looked like before the police apparently escalated. And they were locked arms in front of the doors of the building, singing songs and, chanty kind of songs about what their political goals are, which is a ceasefire.
Were there people in the building trying to get out, though? I mean, you can't.
Not that I saw, not that I'm aware, but that also wasn't the allegation. I think part of why this became such a controversy is that Congressman Sherman went on afterward onto Abby Phillips's show. I would actually think we have that clip, and he seemed to have misrepresented what happened. Let's take a look.
Yesterday, there were over 200,000 pro-Israel demonstrators with a permit, entirely peaceful. And here you have a demonstration less than 1,000th as large that's also getting publicity. And it's getting publicity because their willingness to attack police, as they did with pepper spray, is a force multiplier. A few demonstrators willing to attack police getting a fair amount of publicity, whereas the amount of publicity for 200,000 peaceful demonstrators proportionately less.
And I just want to make a note here that we don't know exactly who was responsible for the pepper spray, but as we continue to report on this story, we'll learn more. Congressman Brad Sherman, I do thank you for joining us tonight.
So, for obvious reasons, people were frustrated about the misrepresentation there. He's, of course, right that the pro-Israel peace rally earlier this week was largely peaceful, but the question is whether or not that's because the police didn't make the choice to pepper spray and escalate in that context as opposed to this other context. There were a number of moments. We saw some near the White House about a week or so ago in which the Jewish Voices for Peace activists and some of these other Jewish groups have been jostled and pushed around, and have videos very similar to this with Capitol police officers or whatever police officers were there by the White House. So it does seem to be a bit of a trend.
What do you make of the new polling numbers on support for ceasefire?
It's not surprising. I mean, they ticked up slightly overall. I think it was 66 last time we discussed them, and now it's gone up to 68. It is interesting that there is a bit of a partisan split, but still half of Republicans also want a ceasefire, overwhelming majorities of Democrats, which raises the question. I mean, when you have people like Brad Sherman, when you have other Democrats referring to these pro-peace protesters as pro-Hamas protesters, that's your constituency. I mean, fine, maybe you don't care about what Republicans think, but we're a year before a general election, and the Democratic Party is making the choice not just ignore the protesters that are protesting outside, saying, hey, close the gap. I mean, that's the point of this protest, right? To say close the gap between the, what was it, 80% of Democrats who want there to be a ceasefire and the 4% of Congress who feels the same way. Instead of saying, well, let me listen to you, let me credit this, to turn around and say, you guys are just pro-Hamas, I don't know if that's a very healthy election strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what specifically that group has said, about the, I've described obviously some of the protesters as pro-Hamas when I read their statements and how they feel about October 7th. I don't know that describes this group.
These Jewish Voices for Peace protesters?
Sure.
I mean, certainly the ADL has called these Jewish groups anti-Semitic. That's where we are right now. Yeah. And so I do think it's a really powerful message.
Well, thankfully, I have never taken the ADL's word for what counts as anti-Semitic.
Yeah, as well you shouldn't. But it is an interesting contrast that's happening here because so many of these protests are being driven by these young, not so young, Jewish activists who are really putting their bodies on the line. And I think the tension between, this identity politics world, I experience this as well as a black person advocating for certain things that I feel like are in the interest of black people, but against the interest of the Democratic Party. The Democrats love to weaponize identity in these ways to say, don't listen to what this person is saying. The real Jews, the real blacks are with us. And so as more and more and more of these Jewish protesters make themselves seen and heard, it'll be interesting to see whether the Democratic Party's narrative has to make any adjustments.
Well, we'll have more to talk about on this subject later in the show, and we'll be back with more Rising right after this.